Hello, my name is Monica Brown, and I teach 8th grade U.S. History and Social Studies at Key Middle School. Today I'm going to take you through a lesson that's about fighting and winning the war. We're going to explore the Battle of Yorktown. We'll look at the diary of George Washington. He was General George Washington at that time. We'll examine the Treaty of Paris, and then we're also going to look at some significant individuals that really made fighting the war a part of their mission. But before we get started, there are a couple of things that I would like for you to have. You will need to have a pen or pencil, and you will need to have paper. And of course, if you like writing in your journal, which sometimes I do too, you may certainly use your journal. So here's your guiding question for today. To what extent did the Battle of Yorktown affect the outcome of the American Revolution? Let me read that again. To what extent did the turning point event of the Battle of Yorktown affect the outcome of the American Revolution? In 1781, the Continental Army fought the last battle of the American Revolution, the Battle of Yorktown. After 6 long years of fighting, the war was about to end. But why? Well, geographic and political factors helped Washington win the war. Well, let's find out by using our mapping lab. You're going to see a set of 3 maps, and we're going to learn about the issues that surrounded the Battle of Yorktown. For each challenge, I'm going to want you to answer some questions. So let's take a look at our first challenge. So here we have a map. I wonder if you know what type of map this is. You may have learned maybe in 6th grade or 7th grade the different types of maps that we use. Even though I have it titled, if I didn't have it titled, would you have known the difference between this map and maybe the other types? Well, we know that this is a political map. And why? Well, because it's telling us exactly where each colony is. We have borders. That's what makes it a political map. So we know where the border starts and where it stops. So here's your question. In which region of the 13 original states is Yorktown located? So let's take a look at this map. And I'm going to look for Yorktown, and there it is, right up there on the coast. Yorktown looks like it was located in the original state of Virginia. So here's challenge 1. What type of water is Yorktown located along? What body of water is Yorktown located along? And what can we tell here? Where is Yorktown located? And take a look at that. Looks like it's along the Atlantic Ocean. And what type of geographic feature do you see here? So take a moment to look at that. And let's see what type of geographic feature are we looking at here. All right. So we see that Yorktown is located along the Atlantic Ocean right there. And it looks like it is along the southern part of that state. Here's your second map. This is called a special purpose map because it's telling us something specific, right? So we use these maps, they use maps like this all the time to kind of give them an idea of what was going on. So here's your second challenge. If British troops tried to escape by moving west, what would they have encountered? And what about if they moved south? What would they have encountered? Now, if they moved west, I'm thinking, and I'm looking here, I'm thinking that they would have run into the American and French armies. Remember, the French at this point, they were our ally. So they are there on our side. So yeah, the British are going to run right into the American and French armies. If they had moved south, well, who would they have run into? You know, it looks like they would have run into the same troops, okay? The American and French troops. So we use this special purpose map to give us an idea of exactly what's going on. And here's your third map. We're going to look at, this is also a special purpose map. And again, even though the questions are the same, I'm going to look at this map because it's a little clearer, okay? I can really see what's going on here. So if British troops try to escape by moving west, we'll see, let's go west. And it looks like they're going to run into American and French armies, right? And then if they went south, yep, it's going to be the same, right? Looks like there's those French ships that are there. Now, remember earlier I asked what type of landform this was located on? Looks like this is located on a peninsula. Yorktown was located on a peninsula. It was a peninsula. And what body of water was it located? Well, we see the James River, all right? We see the York River, and I also see Chesapeake Bay. All right, so take a look at this map and you can really see what the challenges were with fighting in Yorktown. All right, so now let's look at some of the issues that surrounded the Battle of Yorktown. As we read this passage about the issues surrounding the Battle of Yorktown from Washington's point of view, we are going to keep in mind, why were the Americans victorious in Yorktown? So this is from the Diary of General George Washington, written while he was in Yorktown, Virginia, and it was written on October 19th, 1781. As I read, I want you to follow along, and I want you to kind of pull out some things that really surprise you, maybe things that you didn't know, things that resonate with you. This is the end of 6 years of war against the British. We proved that an untrained army with a cause can fight King George's army of professional soldiers and hired soldiers. They fought for money, they fought for freedom, and now General Cornwallis will surrender to me. I wonder if I had accepted the position of Commander-in-Chief of the American armies, if I had known of all the troubles I would face. The British for certain. But Congress never gave us enough money for uniforms, for blankets, guns, and ammunition. But I am not sorry I took the job. 13 tiny colonies fighting the most powerful nation on earth. 6 years of fighting and retreating. Great moments like surprising the British at Trenton, the Battle of Saratoga that made the French realize that we could win. They gave us money, soldiers, and ships. Thousands of French troops here at Yorktown, including the Marquis de Lafayette, a young French noble who came to fight on our side. But the victories did not come easy or often. The winters were impossible. How my soldiers suffered in the snow and ice of Valley Forge. My determination gave my men the will to keep fighting. Now we are the winners. The British are surrendering. It is almost time for the surrender ceremony, where General Cornwallis, leader of the British Army, will hand over his sword to me. So let's take a look here, and this is where you might want to make some notes. Let's debrief. Your first question is, what were some of the challenges faced by Washington and the Continental Army? Second question, what are some reasons the Americans won the Battle of Yorktown? And third, why is Yorktown so important? Well, we can probably look at that third question and we know why it was so important. This was it, okay? The British finally surrendered. Remember that part where General George Washington says, General Cornwallis would hand over his sword to me. That was it. And then some of the challenges that they faced. Well, Congress didn't give them enough money. They didn't have uniforms, blankets, some of the basics. That was definitely a challenge. And don't forget the challenge that they had at Valley Forge as well. And then what are some of the reasons the Americans won the Battle of Yorktown? They were prepared. They had the French fighting with them. They had the Allies. And this reminds me of that question in our last lesson. Do you need to have allies or good leaders to help you win the war? I probably would say yes, most definitely. It definitely helps. And in this case, it helped. So, what was the most important outcome of the Treaty of Paris? Okay. What did you take away from that? What was your takeaway? All right. So maybe one thing that comes to mind is, okay, everything's okay. We've been fighting with each other 6 years. It's kind of let bygones be bygones. All right. Any misunderstandings, we will forgive them. Second thing is that prisoners will be released on either side. Third thing is that the United States is finally free of British rule. So this would be the Treaty of Paris. Here's your question. What is most important? Fighting a war with trained soldiers or fighting with public support? Well, let's look at some of the significant individuals in the American Revolution. We will first look at Abigail Adams, John Paul Jones, James Armistead. So let's look at Abigail Adams. She was the wife of John Adams. Looks like she took care of family farm and children while her husband was away. And she wrote letters to John during the war in support of women's rights. John Paul Jones, America's first naval hero, and looks like he won a major naval battle against the British. And James Armistead, African American slave, and he was a spy for the colonists and posed as an escaped slave and traveled between both armies. Two more people that were important: Wentworth Cheswell, African American church leader, historian, and judge, and Mercy Otis Warren, which was an important female writer. Looks like she wrote some plays, poems, and essays supporting independence. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence announced the creation of the new United States of America. It's a new nation. The new government was the Continental Congress. Many greeted this news with great joy, but some people were really worried because winning a war takes trained soldiers and support of the public. So one thing that we know that in order to fight a war, the soldiers need to be trained in an army. And so we have a German officer, and he helped Americans learn how to handle guns and how to march during the winter. So you remember the challenges at Valley Forge. He also trained American officers on how to command their troops. So remember, these were men that weren't really trained. And it took some important people, some trained people, to come in and help us out on this. So individual soldiers we have that also had important roles in the military that helped. We have Wentworth Cheswell, who was an African American, had written with Paul Revere to warn New Hampshire colonists of British warships. This was in 1774. And he also volunteered to fight in the Continental Army and took part in the Battle of Saratoga. Some soldiers also acted as spies they used to obtain valuable information containing the enemy's battle plans. James Armistead. Now, he was a slave from Virginia. He crossed British lines several times on spy missions for General Lafayette. The military information that Armistead gathered helped the Patriot cause so much that after the war, Lafayette asked Virginia's legislature to grant Armistead his freedom, and it did so in 1786. John Paul Jones also risked his life in the fight for independence, and he is known as America's first naval hero. So to win the war, hey, you've got to have public support. The confidence and backing of American people in the war effort was another important factor in winning the American Revolution. One way to get public support, was gained through the use of propaganda. And propaganda is basically information that's used to persuade people to join your cause. So whether it was songs, plays, essays, stories, posters, those things are considered to be propaganda. So we'll look at one person, Mercy Otis Warren. She wrote many poems and plays. One was called The Blockheads, in which she describes how the British were not able to defeat American soldiers easily. And as Americans began to read her writings, the support for the war effort grew. And then finally, you have women that are beginning to help with the war. You know, their husbands are away fighting. The farms, the businesses, these things still need to happen. They still need to keep going, even if the husbands are gone. So they themselves began to manage the families. They were managing the farms. They were managing businesses. And even though it was really, really hard, you had people like Abigail Adams, who not only managed her farm while her husband John Adams was away through the war, but she also helped as well. Revolution. Abigail Adams. So I just spoke of her briefly. Now, Abigail Adams, born in Massachusetts in 1744, she was married to John Adams, and John Quincy Adams, served as the president. She was well known for a letter that she wrote to John during his absence. And the letters have become a source of information about the American Revolution, things that we just didn't know. And in her famous letter to her husband, she asked him to, quote, remember the ladies. She pressed him to give women equal status with men when forming the new government. So this completely was a change in what had been done before. And then you had Mercy Otis Warren, who was an American patriot. She also wrote plays and poems. And remember, I mentioned the play Blockheads, where she's poking fun at the British. Her husband had gone off to fight, and Mercy decided to write the history of the American Revolution using her notes from meetings and conversations. She strongly believed in independence, liberty, and also, important, the power of the written word. And so now let's look at some African Americans that made huge contributions to the American Revolution. We have Crispus Attucks. We don't know a whole lot about Crispus Attucks. He was born a slave in the 13 colonies, and he gained his freedom when he ran away to become a sailor. And being a sailor was one of the only jobs that was open to free black men at that time. Like many colonists, Attucks was troubled about the basic economic survival under British rule. He is mostly known for the role that he played that unfortunately led to his death during the Boston Massacre. In 1770, Crispus Attucks was the first of 5 unnamed American colonists to be shot and killed by British soldiers. Attucks was credited as the leader and instigator of the heroic disruption against the British Army. Then we have Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley was born in West Africa, but she was sold into slavery at a very early age. She was transported to the 13 colonies, bought by the Wheatley family in Boston. Slave masters taught her to read and write and encouraged her to write poetry once her talents were discovered. She is one of the first African American women to write published poems in the United States. During the American Revolution, she wrote poems that expressed the rebellious ideas of the colonists. In one poem, she wrote about George Washington taking command of the Continental Army. Her work was well received by only Washington, but around the colonies. So Phyllis Wheatley, one of our first African American women to write and publish poems. And now we have Wentworth Cheswell, born a free man in New Hampshire colony in New England. He was the grandson of the first African American landowner in New Hampshire. Wentworth Cheswell came to be the second African American to be elected to public office in the United States. He was a teacher, a historian, an archaeologist, and right before the American Revolution, he rode with Paul Revere to warn the colonists of approaching British warships. He later enlisted in the Continental Army and fought for independence. So that's Wentworth Cheswell. And then finally, James Armistead. He was born a slave in Virginia. And during the American Revolution, he was one of General George Washington's most effective weapons against the British. Armistead played the role of a spy, and he pretended to be a runaway slave and spied for the Patriots. At the Battle of Yorktown, Armistead provided George Washington and Marquis de Lafayette valuable information that allowed Americans to secure victory over the British. The major victory guaranteed freedom for Americans. Sadly, Armistead remained a slave after the war was won. For years, he fought for his freedom, and with the help of Lafayette. He eventually became a free man. So now you have your authentic writing. You have an assignment to do. I want you to think about all of the schools that are here in the Houston Independent School District, okay? So we have Paul Revere Middle School, Crispus Attucks Middle School, Phyllis Wheatley High School, and Patrick Henry Middle School. I bet you didn't know that, did you? Or maybe you attend one of these schools that you heard me mention just now. So here's your assignment. You are going to address the HISD board, okay? This is your opportunity. The HISD board welcomes members of the community to speak on subjects related to the school district. The board meetings are held regularly on the second Thursday of every month. As a student in HISD, you are considered to be a member of the district community. After learning about African Americans' involvement in the American Revolution, you would like for HISD to honor these individuals. You feel that HISD has done a great job naming schools after African American heroes of the American Revolution, such as Crispus Attucks and Phyllis Wheatley. But you think they should build a campus in honor of Wentworth Cheswell and James Armistead. To prepare to address the board on the subject, I want you to write a brief speech explaining why HISD should name their next school after an African American hero of the American Revolution. Here are some of your must-haves that you're going to have to guide your writing. You need to have an introduction, so tell us who you are, what grade you're in, and what school you attend. Tell us the individual that you want to name your school after. So do you want a school named after Wentworth Cheswell or James Armistead? Give me a brief description on who the individual was, where he was from, was he a slave, was he free, was he a runaway? Explain the contribution of the individual during the American Revolution, and then explain why you believe HISD should name a school after that individual. Why should the individual be honored in our district? Last thing, make sure that your tone is persuasive. You really want to convince them. Make sure you use proper grammar and correct spelling. You have a few minutes to complete this assignment. Thank you so much for joining me today. We did a lot in this lesson. We've looked at a couple of maps. We actually looked at 3 maps: special purpose map, political map. We looked at the Battle of Yorktown. We looked at what the challenges were. We read the diary of George Washington and got a chance to see how he felt during that time. We looked at the Treaty of Paris that outlined this big victory that we have been fighting for so long. And then we ended it by looking at some of the most important people that helped win the war. They may not have been soldiers on the field, but they were important no less. So thank you for joining me today. My name is Monica Brown. I teach 8th grade social studies at Key Middle School. Bye.